Is government raiding the National Insurance Fund? Has government got better things to do than spend significant time publishing every single COVID grant paid out? And why is government spending so much of your money protecting business from electricity price hikes rather than helping you? Chris Thomas asks several interesting questions in tomorrow's Tynwald, and on Agenda we discuss what's behind the questions. Just sour grapes from Chris? Or is he getting to grips with the things that matter to you? Chris Thomas was not able to join me in the studio, but I trust you'll agree this online interview is well worth a listen. Chris Thomas, you've got 6 questions that you're asking on the Tynwald question paper for Tuesday, and also you're answering a question. I think it would be mischievous and wrong of me to ask you to give us the answer to the question you're being asked, but you could perhaps expand a little as to the questions that you are asking.
Okay. The first, we can perhaps see them as questions in 3 pillars, to use modern jargon. One pillar is about the National Insurance Fund, and I'm asking the Treasury Minister what the purpose of that National Insurance Fund is, and about the reviews, the Government Actuary Department reviews, but perhaps also the CI 65 review and the Mercer review that was behind that. Why am I asking that? Well, basically, I was quite surprised by some language that the Treasury Minister used in a written answer recently, when he implied that he seemed to be saying that the National Insurance Fund was there to handle economic fluctuations in some way. And to my mind, it's quite clear the National Insurance Fund there is to provide bedrock for social security and state pensions. And I want to push the Treasury Minister to make sure that he hasn't changed the philosophy of the National Insurance Fund. And
I suppose, my role is to play devil's advocate. Presumably, bearing in mind that the fund is the largest fund that government has, from time to time when there are fluctuations, as the Minister might have referred to them, dipping into the fund, provided it was then topped up in times of plenty, shouldn't necessarily be a concern, should it?
Well, 25 years on, people still talk about dipping into the National Insurance Fund for the hospital and when that money will be paid back. And the answer to that is it won't now. That was decided a year or so ago. In more recent years, we've had 2 or 3 dips in, if you want to call it that. The first one was we spent 100 million from the National Insurance Fund for COVID responses. And then we spent this year, and only myself and the Mr. Speaker voted against it, we gave more or less carte blanche in advance permission for health service, particularly hospital overspend, to be covered from the National Insurance Fund. I was unhappy with that. I wanted specific Tynwald approval when we knew the facts of what we would be spending. Another troubling thing that the Treasury Minister said was that he implied it was the first time that we were going into the National Insurance Fund, which is not true. In most years these days, we actually take the investment income from the fund to pay for social security and hospital expenditure. Look, what I'm basically saying is we have a much larger National Insurance Fund in the Isle of Man than they do in either Great Britain or Northern Ireland. We've never made a decision that we want to reduce that like they did in Northern Ireland and Great Britain 20 years ago. And I don't want anybody to be able to do that without the permission of the people of the Isle of Man whose fund it is and their representatives, Tynwald. So I'm putting on the table that I'm looking after the National Insurance Fund unless there's a definite vote in Tynwald to begin to draw it down, as happened in Great Britain and Northern Ireland in recent decades. It's there for future generations. It's there as a bedrock for young people's state pensions and social security for years to come. 7 or 8 years ago, people were talking about the fund running out. Now we're going in there and using it as a sort of money tree to pay for everything at the moment. That can't be right in my view.
And of course, because I did push the Health Minister on this. I sort of perhaps rather cheekily asked him the question. So you've been given money for an overspend that you haven't actually overspent yet. Surely that's quite an extraordinary gift for any health minister to receive. I mean, he did push back on that and pointed out that, in fact, he would only spend what needed to be spent, and any other monies that had been agreed in principle wouldn't be given to the department. So it's sort of has had Tynwald approval, this, hasn't it?
Well, no, that's the £10 million you're talking about, which is on the face of the Tynwald order paper. Inside the budget debate, there was a separate item as part of the detailed items that Mr. Watterson and myself voted against, which is actually agreeing in advance that Treasury could use some of the investment income from the National Insurance Fund in future year for the health service overspend as well. So there's a separate item, and that's the one that I'm querying. That didn't even get mentioned in the press at the time, I don't think.
And again, the health minister would respond by saying it's an underfund rather than overspend. I mean, it's a bit of a semantic argument, but effectively the review into the health service identified that the health service is underfunded. So is it unreasonable to use the National Health Insurance Fund for this purpose?
Well, £40 million each year comes out of the National Insurance Fund for health. It's not unreasonable, but the purpose of this question is to make sure that the Treasury Minister remembers that the National Insurance Fund is bedrock for state pensions and social security. 7 or 8 years ago, people were saying that they had to work. People were told they had to work to 66 and then 67 because the National Insurance Fund was running out. Now, all of a sudden, it's having over 100 million taken out of it, and it's becoming more and more regular that the investment income is taken out for current expenditure. We've got to remember we've got a very precious reserve in the National Insurance Fund, and it's not for squandering, and that's what my question is about. I've got two other pillars of questions as well.
I mean, I'll ask the questions on this occasion. You've got your chance tomorrow. I mean, it's hard. It'd be hard to justify the term squandering in relation to the National Health or National Insurance Fund. I mean, the 100 million, clearly a one-off in relation to the extraordinary circumstances of COVID. That's hardly squandering the money, is it? How large actually is the fund now?
It's approaching £1 billion, but that's not the point. We were being told 6 or 7 years ago that the fund was running out, and therefore we had to work longer. And we need a government actuary department review, which is again paid for from the fund, to report, which actually answers these questions in actuarial terms. It doesn't really matter to an extent what you think, what I think, what even the Treasury Minister think. What we need is actually need the actuarial evaluation, and that's what this question is about. I'm asking the question in terms of the operation of the Social Security Acts, and have we in the last 4 or 5 years put future generations at risk by beginning to spend, like they did in the GB and in Northern Ireland, money that was providing bedrock for future generations and future social security and future state pensions? Are we making it more likely that what young people are beginning to say was there'll be nothing left for us to come true? Yeah. And it's precious, and I care about future generations, not so much about the short-term politics of being seen to not to do other things to raise the funds that are probably necessary for health, as you're suggesting.
Okay, so moving on then to the other questions that you've got. I mean, you're after the chairman of the Manx Utilities Authority. What's that one all about?
This pillar has got 3 dimensions. It's very controversial at the moment about hedging for Manx utilities and also for Manx gas. We've got much higher gas prices than we've ever had before. We've also got higher volatility, which means the prices are going up and down. I've asked about the policy that's in place, because there seems to be acceptance that Manx utilities denied the chance to Manx gas to hedge. But there seems to be some disagreement about how that happened and whether something different happened this time compared to previous times. So I've got one of my 3 questions to the Utilities Authority Chair is about hedging policy, and I will be pursuing that to see whether things have changed recently. The other 2 are about the impact on 2 types of customers of the increased prices. The first one is that the Chair always used to say, for instance, in the budget back in February, that £176 have been given equally to all of Manx Utilities electricity customers through his shielding, or the board's shielding of electricity customers by using 16 million of reserves and the bond repayment fund. That's definitely not the case. Retail customers, domestic customers, have got an average £176, but the large industrial customers have got a lot more than that. And that's the point of my question. I want to find out how much more that they have, and then I'll be questioning the chair about whether he still thinks it's money well spent to have actually shielded some of the big industrial users of electricity, like the hospital, like Tesco's, like the data centres, like other parts of government, perhaps even pumping sewerage around. I'll be asking him whether he really thinks it's worthwhile spending that sort of money rather than having put that towards gas customers and the alternative energy.
That is the largest consumer of electricity, I think, isn't it? The IRIS, the sewerage system.
So we'll find out.
Yeah,
that's what the question's about. And the other set of customers are the poorer ones. Back in 2018, when the pricing strategy was approved by the Utilities Authority, it included investigating social tariffs. Manx Gas has mentioned that it mentioned back in 2017-18 social tariffs, and I've asked the chair to update us on where we've got since 2018 in terms of social tariffs. It could be called something like warm home discount. It could be that we've decided to take it forward inside the social security budget, but I'm putting the chair on the spot so that he can tell me what the board's thinking is, and also I'll be pursuing him about what dialogue he's had with Treasury and the rest of government, because as far as I can see, Treasury, at least in particular anyhow, seems to be saying hands off, we're leaving it all to the Manx utilities, which doesn't seem to me the right approach to dealing with fuel poverty.
You're listening to Douglas MHK, Chris Thomas, Chair of the Community and Housing Board. And is this not, and I'll shoulder some of the blame for this, is this not the fault of previous governments that could potentially have certainly mitigated against the worst impact of these very significant fuel price hikes by introducing a range of measures to reduce the amount of energy that we actually use? We've had at least 10, maybe 15 years where we could have been doing this sort of work to significantly improve insulation in homes, to reduce the energy usage. Should this not have been done? And are you convinced that government's taking it seriously enough to implement the measures that are going to reduce our dependency on imported energy?
Yes, it should have been done. No, I'm sceptical like you are that it's being done adequately now. And that's why I'm quite angry about this, because 16 million is a lot of money from Manx Utilities reserves to have spent on 1 year's shielding of all electricity customers. If it does turn out that 8 million of that could have been used for something else, wouldn't it have been better if it could have been used for a just transition for oil burners when they're heating their homes, and for gas users, or even for investing in alternative energies and more efficient energy homes? That 8 million, spending it's got an opportunity cost, and the opportunity cost is it could have been used for those sorts of things. And
I suppose you're then moving on to your final pillar of questions. I think a number of businesses, charities such as the one that I'm involved with, we're a little bit surprised to receive an email from government saying that the grants that they received on the various COVID grants, this was all going to be made public unless they chose to opt out of it, which is an interesting interpretation of the Freedom of Information legislation.
Yeah. So I might go down that line of discussing the meaning of freedom of information and the political messaging, but I think there are perhaps two bigger principles I'm going to focus on initially. One of those is that the government has announced that it's going to publish all of the details of COVID scheme recipients, but it's not at the moment minded to publish the money they received from the overall financial assistance scheme, which basically goes to larger companies. And to me, that seems odd. Why would you publish information to sole traders and people who've got, and charities, and everybody's got the smaller amounts of money, but not the bigger ones who've got larger amounts of money? So there seems to be an unfairness in that. So I'm going to unpick whether that's unfair and whether that's what government really, a government that wants to be seen to be transparent and wants to be transparent, whether it's really thought through.
And is that possibly because the companies have responded and said, no, we don't want this information made public?
I'll find out, or it could be that government's decided that it gets some advantage by keeping that sort of information to itself. But I'll find out. I have actually been engaging with officers on this, so I think I know what the answer will be, but I don't want to spoil the surprise for everybody.
And why does this matter? For the average person on the street who is obviously concerned about a range of different issues. This probably may not seem to be that important.
Okay, well, and that goes on to the second point, which is I think Department for Enterprise clearly fluffed the release of the information about the payment to politicians of COVID grants, okay? Because as far as I can tell, the FOI request was just for MHKs who own businesses. So why was a charity's information released? Because Ralph Peake, who's associated with the charity I think you're referring to, doesn't own the organisation that you and him are associated with, and do loads of work and so on. He doesn't benefit from it. Why did we go back to former MHKs? The question was about MHKs who own things. Also, why did we include small shareholders and people who were just directors of things rather than actually owned the things of which they were directors? So it seems to me they got a bit out of hand in actually. Somebody got a bit out of hand in actually giving away information, too much information for the freedom of information response initially. And that goes back to why normal people care about this. Essentially, when you start giving out information, it sucks up resource. And really, even though I am a campaigner for transparency and I took the freedom of information legislation through an amendment, you've got to work out what the value is of what you're doing. And if we are going to release huge amounts of data about grants that went to huge amounts of people, some of it will be wrong and it will take tidying up. And what's the point, as you say? Why do we need to know that this plumber got that much and that plumber only got that much and so on? Why do we really need to know all of that? So I want balance in all of these things, and to get that balance at the same time, another important principle is fairness. And I just think it could be that some people involved in this were a bit enthusiastic about giving out information about some previous politicians and some current politicians, and perhaps common sense went out the window a bit too much.
And then I suppose looking at it from the officer's point of view, from the department's point of view, the desire is to be as transparent as possible. So why would you not? Presumably, the information should be held on a database which should be readily, it should be up to date and accurate.
Well, let's see. Let's see. What at the same time, if you go. I'm very interested to look at Council of Ministers proceedings. They were published until September 2021. No details of Council of Ministers proceedings have been published since September 2021. We've got a huge data set of Council of Ministers quarterly statistical and economic report, and that petered out in March 2020. I'd much rather that we had transparency about Council of Ministers proceedings and about the quarterly economic and statistics than knowing what every little small business person got from the COVID scheme. That's much more in the public interest. So we've got resources that are short at the moment. They're tight and they've got to be prioritised. And I'm just trying to make the Department for Enterprise Minister and officers who've been behind him think about what it is they're getting into. Because although the principle is an easy one to assert, transparency, it does come at a bureaucratic cost, especially if that database isn't going to turn out to be quite as accurate as you and I hope it will be.
The housing crisis was a massive issue at the last general election, which was only 6 months ago. How is the government's response working out? I mean, you're the lead man on this. Are you making any progress?
I'm the chair of the Council of Ministers committee that's trying to optimise and accelerate progress around government. So in the end, the current organisational structure is not very different from what it was last year, but yours truly and his colleagues on the board are trying to optimise things through publishing an action plan. So the action plan that will go to Tynwald for approval, for receipt and approval in May, it is based on the 6 work streams that were put together before Christmas and published in January, as with the Island Plan. And now we've got dated actions with a responsible government department normally responsible for delivering them. So the ones people have talked about first of all have been about homelessness and supported living, a concept of housing first, and that's something where DHSC is taking the lead. Except that we've put together a special project team to work on this intensively for 3 months to try and get something worthwhile in place over the summer, before the winter at least.
Imagine I, as the questioner here, am someone struggling to find somewhere to live. At the moment, I started off with maybe a 50% full tank of enthusiasm. Now after that your previous answer, I'm down to maybe 30%. What can you actually tell me, which might actually give me a little bit more confidence and enthusiasm? Real action that's going to be happening in the next 6 months.
This is real action. This is real action. So there are all types of homelessness, and people perceive themselves as homeless in different situations. So the one I described at the moment, if you genuinely are homeless in the Isle of Man, you've got no place to go, you go to Broadway, and a church charity rolls out a mat for you in the day and in the night, and the following day you roll it back up again, and they try to support you to get your life back in place. Yeah. Now we'll have a different system. We'll have a system within a few months whereby we'll be putting people in houses, and we'll be wrapping them around with services. So it'll be a more organised system. So that will be something that people will really perceive. If you're a young person, or you get divorced, or you've got another sort of crisis where you need to start out again, the shared equity scheme will be changed if it goes to plan by August. So Department of Infrastructure is working with Attorney General's chambers to change the thresholds and the other terms on the existing shared equity schemes, so that it go to Tynwald in July, so that the new scheme is in place by August. And then alongside that, we've got a structural review, fundamental review, to think about building on the excellent pilot that's gone on in Colby with mid-rent schemes that you and I launched when we were responsible for housing back in 2015-16, to hugely expand that provision, because that provides people with cheaper than private sector renting and the ability to save up for a deposit for owner occupation. I'm sure you're aware that we're working with Manx Development Corporation on in as much as they tell us what they're doing. And one of the things that they're doing is that they've made a planning application for 37 1- and 2-bedroom flats to be in the old nurses' home in the middle of Douglas. And those flats will be for key workers. I'm actually engaged with the Department of Education in particular about trying to come up with a scheme for key workers, teachers, even for September, October. So they're 3 very practical initiatives. Another one would be on empty properties. You'll remember at the beginning of your time in the House of Keys, there was an Empty Properties Initiative Committee, and essentially they came up with some conclusions that were that at the time they didn't need to do some things that they'd imagined they might have to do. I think we'll probably need to go back to those conclusions from 2001, 2002, and actually do them this time, because now we've got 6,000 vacant properties, whereas back 20 years ago we only had 2,000 vacant properties. So I think we're going to need to follow that up. Conveyancing is a mess in the Isle of Man, and I'm trying to build on, and again, something that you might remember from your Dolgi days, which is that we made progress previously about changing the conveyancing system in the Isle of Man, and I'm hoping to get that report down off the shelf and put it in place in the next 12 months at least, if not 6. So there you go. Hopefully they're all practical things where you're back up to 70 miles per hour and going and all over the mountain at high speed with full of confidence and optimism.
Yeah, my tank is filled. Thank you very much for that. The Landlords Registration Act had royal assent, but is it actually implemented yet? Is there anything happening with it?
No, it's not in force. So one of the amendments that I moved successfully was that it can't be brought into force until regulations are made for the minimum standards and for the registration part, and even for the enforcement tribunals part. So those regulations have now got to be worked up, consulted about, and then brought into force before the Act can come into force. So there are people who believe it's coming into force at the end of this year. It won't be. We're at the stage now, as part of our housing working plan, where we've got to begin specifying those regulations, consulting about them and working out. That's why I was quite surprised to hear the landlords talking about something going on Just there isn't anything going on, except which they would know about it if there was, because we'd be engaging with them about new standards and new tribunal processes and new registration processes.
And the they or the someone who would be engaging with whoever, landlords association, whoever it may be, is that you through the housing board? Is it the infrastructure minister? Is there some other agency responsible for this?
The infrastructure minister already responded in the Manx radio interview and said it wasn't going to be him. It's not us yet. So if things change, we'll take that on. And I certainly am beginning to set up working groups with the permission of the board to begin to take that on. What I'm focused on first is a market solution to this and an industry solution to this. So to me, the absolutely crucial first thing is putting together a better system for taking rental deposits, and then a system for arbitrating if there's any dispute about paying back those deposits or the use of the deposits. And I believe if we focus on getting that system in place, it will have the intended consequence of improving the standard of contracts around the private rental market, and it'll also begin to reduce the amount of argument about it. So that's where my initial focus is, and that's reflected in the action plan and is identified as a specific action. So I hope to put together a working group made up of landlords, tenants, representative organisations, people who know lots about this, to actually begin to put in place such a deposit protection and arbitration system.
So despite your answer saying it's not me and it's not him, it sounds like you think it might be you at some point in the not too distant future that will be responsible for this. Yeah,
I think it's our fourth quick win, and so we're concentrating before July on delivering the two things I mentioned about shared equity and homelessness, and the third one be emergency loans inside the social security system. And then I regard this alongside empty properties, which is probably the fifth win, as being the next thing that we're going to move on to. And I've already talked to people and I've got an estimate about how hard it will be. But once you know how hard it will be, you've got challenges that you can overcome. And that's where we are now. We know roughly, I think, how many deposits there are in the Isle of Man. We know what the interest could be from those deposits. And so we know at the moment, I believe, that we haven't got enough money to actually pay for the arbitration that will result, because at the moment we've got lots of disputes between landlords and tenants, as you can tell from observing social media. So through time, the process will improve and the amount of complaints will go down and the amount of squabbles will go down. But initially we're going to have a lot of arbitration to do, and therefore you're going to need a lot of stuff. I have in mind that somebody like the Office of Fair Trading could perhaps provide the arbitration service, but we need to, that's all the sort of thing that will be subject to consultation, and that's not agreed in my board as yet either.
So the Landlords Registration Act received royal assent. When was that?
In December.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So it's in government terms, it's a relatively short time for someone to have got a hold of this and done something about it. It is surprising, though, to learn that something as important as this, the minister who would appear to be responsible is saying he's not going to be doing anything with it, and yourself as chair of the housing board, as yet the housing board doesn't appear to have responsibility. It does seem a bit strange that royal assent would be given for a piece of legislation and then there's still no agreement as to where that might, the responsibility for implementing it.
I can't believe what I'm hearing here, though, because obviously the Disability Discrimination Act was on the statute books from 2006 until it was fully implemented in 2020. I got the impression it was sort of a tradition that we pretended we'd done something and so on, but it's not going to be anywhere near that timescale. The Housing and Communities Board has got onto this issue. It's got it scheduled in the work stream. We haven't got any staff as yet working under the Housing and Communities Board. The fund is controlled by Treasury. We have to get a department to make an application to Treasury for expenditure, and we're a transformation program. We're not a board, we're not a department with any recurrent. We're a transformation program, effectively. That's quite clear from the fund. And so what we've done is we're making an application to the fund for a person to work, and this will be one of the major projects they will start working on when that person is in place. And essentially what we'll be doing is, if the board agrees it, is we'll be putting together a working group made up of tenants organisations, landlord organisations, general experts involving estate agents, professionals, and other spheres like that to actually come up with a proposal that hopefully they can all sign off on. So the next stages of getting it through the civil service and Tynwald will be easier because there's a consensus. It's a bit like how we solve the houses and multiple occupation legislation, you and I working together, because that the key for that was getting the landlords to accept it and the fire service to accept the fire regulations, and we did that by engaging everybody and coming up with a compromise, and that's what we need to do in this case with the deposit protection and an arbitration scheme, and then that I think will lead on to standards in other areas as well, because they will be captured inside the basic private rental contract, I think.
And I suppose if the Landlords Association is correct, you really do need to decide who is going to take responsibility for this fairly swiftly, because the Landlords Association basically saying that landlords are taking advantage of the high house prices and selling up before the Act is fully implemented, because they feel that government doesn't understand their concerns and needs, and they quite frankly don't fancy being landlords once this Act is implemented.
Certainly, I'm not saying they're correct or they're incorrect, because we would need statistical evidence, which we'll get from the registry eventually about this, but certainly there are landlords who are selling up. I'm told by estate agents they tend to be older landlords who've got 3 or 4 properties, and they're beginning to think that looks like it's becoming too much for them at their stage of life, and there were always a retirement plan and so on. So there are quite a few houses that have been let out in places like Belafton, Governor's Hill, Ballacameen, Ballabruey, round Douglas, that have been let out for 20 years and are now being purchased by owner-occupiers from those sorts of people. Okay, so you could argue that's a good thing. You could argue that the one-way traffic from houses being rented out privately to being owner-occupied is beginning to change. Also, the second point is the news and the planning applications, to me, seem filled with people converting retail, office, derelict sites into new flats. So, for instance, we've got the 37 new flats in the nurses' home. We've got Port St Mary Marine Lab, Port Erin Marine Lab development, which has got flats in it. We've got North Quay and Douglas flats. We've got Trevelyan Guest House on the promenade that's got flats, that's got a planning application in. So it seems to me there's lots of applications for conversions to flats, even some tourism accommodation. I think I saw somewhere that the former chief minister seems to have applied for his holiday accommodation to be converted into residential accommodation. So I think there's lots of anecdote that there's lots of people actually taking advantage of the high prices to convert things into residential accommodation, presumably for letting as well. So I think there's all sorts of things going on, and we'll only know what's going on after it's happened to an extent. But I do think that all of this leads to the fact that we need better quality. We're getting probably more modern, better quality accommodation. We're getting changes in the market, and we need to make sure that the law and the practical arrangements around contracts and deposits keeps up with that.
Government's role, if it's not for anything, well, maybe there's 2 roles for government. One is to step in an emergency. Now, all the MHKs who stood, and indeed several people who stood and weren't successful, talked about a housing crisis. So you would kind of think that government should be stepping in if this crisis it really exists, and I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that calling it a crisis may not be wholly unreasonable. But the other thing that government should do is act as a kind of a moderating influence, so that the peaks and troughs are less extreme. So is there a role? I mean, presumably the Landlords Registration Act has a role to ensure that we have a good quality, well-regulated rental market. Is that an important thing to have in the island ban?
Yeah. So in a crisis, we need to have laws and arrangements that deal with the crisis. And the biggest gap in that space is the fact that we don't have homelessness defined in law, and we don't have anybody responsible for dealing with homelessness. So that needs addressing urgently, and I've described that to you. In terms of the market, I see government's role as the regulator, as put forward policy and law as necessary, and perhaps also setting up a housing association if we need reform in terms of delivery bodies. But so that's how I see it in the big picture. But that we've got a work stream along those lines in the Housing and Communities Board entitled "How We Work in Housing," and we'll know more about that in 12 months' time. To me, dealing with the substantial issues of real people's lives and real people's homes is more important than thinking about how we organise it. But I do think we will be changing the balance between how the state does it and, as you say, regulation and policy and law, and dealing with things in a crisis, and more what the state should do rather than getting involved directly in providing people with houses necessarily.
Final question then. Directly after the election, I think most people on the Isle of Man would be forgiven for thinking that government's highest priority would have been addressing the perceived crisis in housing. 6 months on, do you think many people would think quite so optimistically about how eager government would be to address this issue?
Well, I think when they see the new shared equity scheme, they'll see that we've adjusted that scheme in the light of the higher prices and changes to income and changes to interest rates. So that's a reflection of the market. No, the Isle of Man government doesn't have the resources, even using the whole of the National Insurance Fund, to affect the UK property market. And the Isle of Man house prices, property prices do go up and down in line with UK to a significant extent. So I don't know if that's the answer to your question, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to create opportunities for people who don't have adequate housing at the moment. We've got a work stream entitled Homes for All. Deliberately chosen that title because it goes back to the period after the Second World War when we had another housing crisis. And I do hope that with social housing, with mid-rent schemes, with perhaps with guaranteeing mortgages, working with the banking sector to improve law so they can bring more products here, we can actually make things better across the piece in a realistic timescale for people who have got pent-up demand for better quality housing here on the island. Because it's so important for society. If you've got a good home, it's so much easier to have a good life and a good job and that sort of thing.
Is it okay for government to occasionally raid the £1 billion National Insurance Fund? It'll be interesting to hear what the Minister says. Is the government release of COVID grant information excessive, and does it set precedents for all government grants to businesses being publicly available in the future? And is the MUA really putting the interests of major electricity users ahead of those of the hard-pressed Manx public? Please get in touch with Phil Gaughan at manxradio.com and let me know your thoughts and views on the programme. But for now, I'm Phil Gaughan, Goramayo. Thanks for listening.